This is going to be a slightly different presentation from the others that you've probably seen today. I'm not going to sell to you. I'm not going to talk about Starburst in any great detail. I'm going to talk about data mesh. And data mesh is not a thing. It's not something you can buy. It's not something that you can just take off the shelf. It's not a technology. I would argue that Starburst is uniquely positioned to enable a data mesh, but I'm going to focus really on what a data mesh is and kind of why you need it. So I spend quite a lot of my time talking to people like Zsomek Dagani, who is the kind of the founder of the concept of data mesh, along with arguments and debates and discussions in the data mesh community, and talking to prospects that we have and customers who have adopted a data mesh paradigm. And really in the next sort of 25, 30 minutes, I'm going to just explain and talk a bit about my experiences and my views on a data mesh. So Zsomek has coined this term, and I think the focus here is really this social technical aspect. And that's really quite key, because when you think about a data mesh, actually a lot of the aspects that a data mesh is concerned with is the organization of your company. It's the business process and the people and the culture. I tend to think of it in a sort of a less grandiose way, and I think of it as the decentralisation of the ownership, the transformation and the serving of data in an organization. And so if we think about that for a moment, and we think about kind of the historic paradigm of data and sort of data landscapes, we have this sort of picture where we have operational systems that are represented in the operational data plane. We may have lots of those, point of sale systems, web traffic systems, manufacturing data, IoT data, healthcare records. We have a lot of data that sits in that operational plane in many different systems, and it's used to run the business. It's used to make everyday decisions to support the applications that help the business actually run. Then we have this function in pretty much every organization, which is basically the ETL piece, the data pipeline, the data transformation, however we want to describe it. It's the function and the people and the organization that are responsible for that process of really understanding the data in the operational plane, understanding the technology, understanding data transformation techniques, and making that data then available to analytic users in the analytic data plane, and putting it into various data platforms, data warehouses, cloud data warehouses, data lakes, object stores, whatever the repositories may be, so that analysts can, and data scientists and BI users can make better decisions which result in better actions, which ultimately result in better revenue, or reduce cost or reduce risk. The fundamental problem is that we have this disconnect. We've got three different sets of concerns. We've got people on the operations side who are really concerned with keeping the technology up and running, collecting the data that's relevant. We have the guys in the middle who have probably the hardest job of all, because they need to understand those operational systems, they need to understand all the technologies there, understand the technologies around the ETL piece, and also understand the target technologies in the analytic plane. And that's a hard job. And so really, and then if we come to that kind of the analytic plane, sorry, I've lost my train of thought. The guys in the analytic plane are going to be basically responsible for making those better decisions. So and they're going to be concerned with the data that they need to make those better decisions. And so their concern is really, how do we organize that data? But the question is, how do those analytic guys get access to more data, to better data, to different data? They go back to the ETL function and they say, can we get this data? Can we have these additional columns? Can we see this data in maybe a different form? And ultimately, those guys in the middle have to go back to the operation system. And so you have this disconnect from operation to analytics. And if you think about a really simple example where someone might, in the operations plane, they might have the ability to capture different and better data for a particular analytic initiative, But if they don't capture that, then the analysts can never know that it's even there to ask the question. So there's a potential for a very tremendous missed opportunity. And essentially, this is the problem statement that data mesh is attempting to resolve. So just to kind of reiterate some of those, some of those problems, we've got this inability to scale data sources. So bringing on new operational systems is easy, or relatively easy, but then having the ability to extract the right data in the right format to the end users to make better decisions, that's hard, right? That's a tricky piece of work to do, and I'm sure if you think in your organizations, that might take weeks, months, or perhaps even years. And then we've got this thing about different user concerns. So as an analyst, I may want the data in one format and another format for another set of the business, another concern. And we might want to bring on new analytic initiatives based on some collection of data. Again, this is a hard problem to solve because we, as an analyst, we need to work through and get access to data. We don't know where that data resides. There's that disconnect of concerns. And ultimately, if you think about it, we are, as an industry, we're spending, or organizations are spending a lot of money on infrastructure, data, people, and arguably, we're not materializing the value that we could from that investment. So, if we think about that in a slightly different way, and we think about the real objectives of a data mesh, what we want to do is encourage and enable agility over a sustained period of time. So we want to make or enable organizations to be able to respond to market conditions, to respond to internal changes, but be able to do it over 3 years, 5 years, 10 years. We want to have a platform that enables us to do that. And that agility will enable us to basically generate that additional value and see the result of that investment. And if we think about those bottlenecks, all those blockers that I talked about before, we've got that monolithic pipeline. I see this a lot when people talk about data mesh. They have like a single box talking to a set of arrows in a single box. The reality is that there's not a single box. There's hundreds of boxes in terms of operational systems. But they all have these pipelines that lead into analytical systems, and you have this kind of complex linkage, if you will, which is tightly coupled. And really what we're doing with data mesh is bringing together, and I'll go into this in more detail, we're bringing together folks and organization and skills across those three concerns into a single domain. And again, I'll talk about this in a little more detail. We're removing that fragility, that brittleness that we have in those pipelines. So we're really enabling organizations to have that agility, and more granularly, we're enabling functions within the business to be much more agile. And then the last piece is this piece about talent. And I think this will become clear as we go through some of the slides. I think today there's not enough data engineering talent in the market. Arguably, data mesh makes that problem worse. You need more data engineers and not fewer. And so this is where we start thinking about technology to abstract away some of the complexity of knowing and understanding about the technologies that are involved in operational systems, the data in those systems, the technologies that we use for transformation, the technologies we use for analytics, and abstracting some of that, or a lot of that complexity away to reduce the cognitive load, if you will, of the folks that are doing this work. And we can do that through this concept of abstraction to make their lives simpler, to give them a SQL interface, if you will, to be able to augment the data engineering talent that we've got. So we can use more generalist skills to support the requirements of a mesh. So there are 4 principles of a data mesh. We've got this concept of domain ownership, and I'm going to go through these in more detail on the following slides. We've got this concept of domain ownership. So really what we're saying here is a domain becomes responsible for data products. And when we think about a domain is really a collection of people. It's a collection of those concerns across the business, the operational, the transformational, and the analytic piece. So we're bringing those folks together, and we're making them responsible for, in essence, a module a modularized piece of the data pipeline. We talked about that data pipeline between the two, the operational and analytics planes. And what we're essentially doing here is we're giving them responsibility and ownership for a piece of that. And that piece that we're giving them responsibility for essentially is a data product. When we think about data as a product, this is a very different concept than what we've thought of previously. And again, I'll talk about this more. But when we think about data products, we're looking at generating something that is useful, something that is valuable to the end users. So the guys in the domain can be measured on the usage and the adoption of that data to the point where, and I've seen this in organizations, the domain is incentivized financially for the use and the reviews of the data as the data as a product. And I think that's a very different concept, than what we've seen in the past, where we've had, warehouses with marts that people can use and use and abuse. What we're really doing here is making sure that people want to use and get value from that data. And to be able to do this for these domains, to be able to build these data products, we need to give them some sort of technology. And that's where we start getting into this self-service data infrastructure. So really, we need to be able to, again, abstract away a lot of that complexity to enable the domains to do their work, to create these data products, and to get them out into the business to make those better decisions. And then if you think about that kind of logically, you'll think, well, that sounds like chaos. That sounds like anarchy. What we've now got is a bunch of folk generating a bunch of data and sort of giving it out to the business. What we really need is some way of being able to make those data products conform to particular standards. We need to make sure they're interoperable, for example. I want two data products that I can bring together to generate some additional business insight. And that's where this federated computational governance piece comes in. So I'm just going to dive down into these four aspects in a little more detail. So one of the questions when I talk about data mesh to prospects and customers is this concept of domains. What is a domain? I don't think there's a right or wrong answer. In one line, I would say a domain is a group of people who are responsible for some data products. They own it and they are accountable, and that's really it. We need to give ownership. We need to have defined ownership for data products. If we go beyond that and we think about, well, how do we really do that? There are a number of different approaches. This is based on or inspired by some of Zhimek's work, which basically says we can have domains that are aligned to the source data. And if we think about data warehousing techniques of old, one of the first things we do when we're modeling a data warehouse is we do subject modeling. So we might have a product, we might have a customer. These are subjects. So we may have domains. We may have a customer domain, and a customer domain that's responsible for data products associated with customer data. We may have a product domain that enables or provides and owns data that's responsible for, data that's relevant to products. An alternative approach is to align domains with consumption. So if you think about your organization structures today, you've probably got risk and finance and operations and maybe logistics, and actually say, well, let's just keep that organization structure. Let's bring in data engineering talent into that structure, and let those guys be responsible for creating data products that are relevant to other parts of the business that need to have access to that data. And there's kind of a spectrum. There's not a right or wrong answer. I have lots of conversations about how you get from where you are to where you want to be, and this is one of the first things that you need to think about, but you don't need to complete this before you sort of begin the next step of your journey. And if we just have a quick example from an e-commerce site, what we can see here is we've got a number of domains, merchant, user marketing, for example, and they're generating data products. And those data products are then being consumed by other domains to generate further data products. And actually, this is where we start getting the concept of the mesh, right? So the mesh is really this idea that we have data products that are the nodes of the mesh, and the consumption of those data products by other domains to then do further work are the links, if you will, in the mesh. And so this is a nice simple way of showing why we call a data mesh a data mesh. So I'm just going to skip on to data and products, and I could talk at length about these, so I'm sort of purposely kind of going through these at a reasonable rate. So when we think about a product, and we'll come on to the data mark question because that always comes up in a moment. When we think about a product, a successful product needs to have at least these three attributes. So it needs to be valuable in its own right. I need to be able to use that data product to answer some questions. I shouldn't have to combine a data product with another data product and another data product to get value. There should be at least some stakeholders in the organization that are, and ideally more than one, that are able to get value from just using this data product as it is. It needs to be usable. And I'll come on to a little bit about what I mean in detail, but I need to be able to find it, I need to be able to connect to it, I need to be able to access it, I need to use this data product. And then lastly, it needs to be feasible. There are limits to the technology that we've got. There are limits to the way we can use data, personal data, for example, in maybe targeting particular individuals for promotional offers, for example. So the data product needs to be feasible for whatever purpose that we want to use it for. Now, if we think about data products for a moment, and again, this is from my experience of talking to lots of organizations, I've kind of categorized 5 different perspectives of what people think a data product is. So on the far side, we've got this concept that a data product is a table, or a collection of tables, or a view. I've used the word table there, but it could be any of those 3 things. I would suggest that's not really that usable, right? It's some data somewhere. How do I find that? So the next thing is this concept of a table and metadata. And what do I mean by metadata? I mean the ability to understand what's in that data before I access it. I understand how I access it. I understand who else in my organization thought this data was useful, how many times it's been used in the last 24 hours, when it was last updated, what the data quality of this data is, what are the various columns, and maybe things like what are the PII, GDPR restrictions that are associated with this table. There's quite a lot in that metadata piece. But these are things that are important when we're thinking about a product. This is one of the differences between data products and data marts. And then we've got this concept of an access pattern. And what I mean by this is we might have a data product that we have different use cases for. You'll probably all want a SQL interface to it. Some consumers may want an API. They may want to pull out individual records from this data product. We may have a requirement for a streaming access pattern. These access patterns all form part of a data product, along with the metadata and the table. The 4th perspective I've seen is this concept of bringing code into the definition of a data product. And what I mean by code is the transformation code that is required to generate the data set that is part of the data product, or the data sets. And this is quite popular, and this starts getting into this concept of, well, how often does it run? What sort of data am I accessing under the covers? If I wanted to execute this at the point of consumption, then clearly code would be a very useful very useful as a part of the data product. And then the last one over here is this concept of bringing infrastructure into the data product. And so starting to think like infrastructure as a code, like a Kubernetes deployment, for example. So this is the infrastructure that's required to run the code to create the data set that forms part of the data product. And so what we would be saying in this example is that the folks in the domain would be responsible for saying, actually, to generate this data product, or the data set within the data product, given these SLAs, we need 5 computers of size X. And then, when we change the data product and create a new version of that data product over time, we may need, 6 computers of size Y. And so this infrastructure definition, this infrastructure as code, forms part of the data product. My personal opinion on this is that I think this is too far. And the reason I think this is too far is because one of the central concepts of data mesh is to reduce the cognitive load on any individual to understand lots of different concerns. And if we're asking data engineers BI people, risk experts, finance experts, whatever the domain is, to understand infrastructure. I think personally that's going too far. People have different opinions. I think realistically, a data product, given what I've seen and the use of data mesh and the implementations, is very definitely in sort of this middle and the one slightly to the right. The table, the access pattern, the metadata, and also the code. That seems to be what people are evolving towards in terms of a data product. And what you can start to see immediately is that's not a data mart. This is a very different thing. So let's quickly move on. So just sort of digging into a data product in a bit more detail. What we can see here down the right-hand side, left-hand side, is some of the usability metrics. So we need to have data products that we can discover. We need to have some way of finding them where they need to be understandable, they need to be addressable, they need to be secure. And secure is a really interesting concept in a data mesh. What we're starting to do is we're starting to federate or decentralize, or delegate is probably the correct term, the security down into the domain. So a data product needs to have security built into it. And the reason for that is because the people in the domain should be experts in the usage of data. So they are best placed to be able to write the policies and the permission definitions for access to that data. If I'm an expert in healthcare data, for example, I probably have more knowledge about healthcare data than some central IT function or whatever else it is. We need to have interoperability, and so this starts getting a little into the federation piece. We need to have, where we have common data entities across data products, we need to have standardization. I need to be able to join two data products together, in a relatively easy fashion. I need this data to be trustworthy. So I need to be able to, perhaps I need to be able to see lineage of this data and how that data changes over time. These all form part of the data product. I need to be able to access it, and as I said before, I need to have it to be sort of valuable in its own right. Data products could live in many different systems, and I think that's kind of an important thing to grasp as well. There's nothing in data mesh that says actually you should bring your data together, and I'll talk a little bit more about that on the next pillar of data mesh. But lastly, we've got these different access methods to that data product that I've already mentioned. So if we think about the platform, the third element of a data mesh, what we're trying to do is give the folks in the domains autonomy over their creation, ownership, management of data. We're trying to give them autonomy. They should not have to go to someone in infrastructure or the infrastructure platform to with requests for data. And what we're starting to see here is this split between those who run the platform and those who are responsible for the platform and those who use the data. Traditionally, you've had like a DBA, let's say an Oracle database or whatever it might be, and we've gone to them and said, can I have data in this form? They are typically also responsible for the infrastructure, for the database. And what we're doing with data mesh is we're putting a very thick line between those two concerns, those two responsibilities, and saying those in the domain are now responsible for the structure of that data. Those in the infrastructure platform are now responsible for managing, maintaining the systems in which that data resides. There's interesting questions that we could get into where authentication and authorization fit. Authorization clearly fits into the domain. Authentication perhaps more so down in the platform. There's also interesting conversations about if I need, and I have seen this, if I need new data platforms, as I'm in a domain and I need a new data platform, I don't have the technical capabilities, then I can bring that in. As soon as that technical platform is required by more than one domain, then really that should become part of the infrastructure as a platform. And so there's quite a lot of this seems very simple at the highest level, but when you start digging in, there's a lot of questions about how this will work. And I could spend quite a lot of time going into my thoughts on how all this should work and as I say, the experiences I've had with clients. But we've only got a few minutes. So just to kind of put that into some sort of context, if we think about a life cycle of a data product, we've got someone over there who's a data product developer who's building that data product. They're building the code and they're defining the specification of the data product. And then we're deploying that, and we're deploying that essentially into the mesh. we're making, as soon as we make, so the data doesn't really exist in the mesh until it becomes a data product, and that's that deployment piece. So we need to be able to publish this out to enable people to then consume it. And what we want is this we want to be able to deploy it out to this plane in the middle here, so that other domains can start to discover and use it, other people can start to access it. And what you'll see here is we've got this interesting split between kind of infrastructure down the bottom here and this plane above. And there are various different, you'll see maybe different connotations of this with multiple planes and things, but broadly there's two planes, where you really want to abstract away that complexity from the guys that are generating the data products and consuming those data products. And ultimately we provision this out, and we have input ports into the data product, the data that's going to flow in and form part of the data set within the product. And then we may have output ports where we have consumers or other data products that are going to consume this data downstream. So the last piece I'm going to talk about is federated governance. And so this is, I think, a really interesting area. And I'll be very open. I think this is the least mature space. I think this is probably going to mature really fast. In the original specification for data mesh, the concept of the governance piece was almost like a footnote, and in subsequent academic or theoretical articles it's become more and more prominent. When I talk to organizations, this is something that is a sort of a concern right up front, because we need to control data, we need to have quality standards, we need to have the security, we need to make sure that we've got the relevant data and up-to-date data, etc. So if we think about some of that, what we actually need to do is start federating or decentralizing governance. We need to push that out into the domains. They become responsible for quality. They become responsible for security. And when I say quality, they become responsible for not only the quality of the data set, but also the reporting of that quality. However, we need interoperability. We need these things to look similar, to expose similar metadata. And so what we are going to end up, and I'll just jump on, actually, I'll come back to that. So what we're going to end up with is a combination of centralized governance and federated governance, and I'll talk a bit about that. The last piece I just want to mention is we're going to need some form of automated execution of, we need to automated execution of a lot of the policies that we are defining. So these guys up in these domains need to be able to define these policies, but then the infrastructure needs to apply and enforce them. One slide. So if we think about that, what we really need is this concept of delegating for governance, controls, and management of these rules, if you like, policies and permissions, down into the domains. But then we need to have standards. So we need to be able to say a product has to have a quality metric, it has to have an SLA, it has to have a series of metadata. And we define these at the kind of mesh level, if you will. But then the implementation of those is down in the individual teams. As I say, there's a lot of automation of these policies, and I think this is the area where there's going to be most investment in ideas and research and development as we go forward with the concept of a data mesh over probably the next period. So I'm being told that we're finishing. So what I'm going to say is we haven't got enough time for questions. I knew we wouldn't, because data mesh is a really big topic and I only had 30 minutes. But I'm more than happy to have questions and have long discussions and arguments, if you wish, over on the Starburst stand, over the big stand in the middle. So thank you very much.